I'm delighted and honoured to welcome our speaker for tonight's donor celebration. Professor Jackie Murray is currently a fellow at the American Academy in Berlin and will be taking up a post at the University of Buffalo in New York in 2023. And Jackie has twin expertises in her research. She is a scholar of Hellenistic poetry, and Hellenistic poetry and the poetry of Alexandria is that most difficult and charged and engaged period where scholars and poets engaged with archaic and classical Greek culture, and their work fueled and inspired work in classical Rome. It is a time when creativity, poetry, scholarship, scientific knowledge, and political engagement were all fused together in the most erudite and complicated forms of poetry. And Jackie has been an outstanding interpreter of this poetry. She teases out all of the different dimensions of it with clarity and authority and wisdom. And hearing her speak about classical literature, about Hellenistic poetry, either informally or formally, is always a delight. Jackie's other area of expertise is on race and classics, particularly with a focus on the reception of classics in African-American and Afro-Caribbean literature. And again, Jackie brings not only great integrity and intellectual integrity to this work, but also great creativity. And one of the things she has fueled is the ongoing Patois Iliad project, which she was talking to our students about this afternoon, and which I'm sure she will talk to anyone about at the reception if they wish. And it's really delightful that Jackie has proposed to speak today on a topic which brings together both of those areas of her expertise by speaking on race and racecraft in Greek epic. So friends, a warm welcome, please, to our distinguished speaker, Professor Jackie Murray.
Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you very much, Ellen, for the wonderful welcome. And I thank the donors for making this happen. I thank the audience for attending, some of you twice. We were here, heard me earlier. And so today I'm going to speak on race and racecraft in Greek epic, case study being Apollonius Argonautica, which is my favorite Greek epic poem. So I have no intention whatsoever of canceling Homer or Apollonius or any of these poets. So just in case anybody's worried about that. Now, I thought I would start with a fairly recent controversy. Disney's Little Mermaid backlash has reached insane heights. And how many of you are familiar with this? A couple of hands. Some of you just tuned it right out. But yeah, there's an issue here again. Once again, we have people with racist perspectives on the world freaking out over the representation of mythical, like she's a mermaid, mythical characters as non-white, right? And I thought I would pick the most ridiculous response being, person is, the tendency that we classicists will do, look, these are mythical characters, they can be interpreted, the ancient Greeks would have not worried about this, so that the tweet at the top, that's what he's trying or she's trying to say. But then of course the response is, considering mermaids were supposed to live under the sea where there isn't any sunlight, they wouldn't need any melanin in their skin. So if mermaids existed, then they would be very, very pale skinned. Besides, the character Ariel is white. I wonder how she managed to change her race. Okay, so this is the context. And what's really going on is the fact that the mythological imaginary of most people in the West, and I'm using that word advisedly, is white, right? We imagine or we are made to imagine, if you're not white, imagine the characters of the text that we read as racially white. And now it doesn't become a thing, or race does not become salient, that in fact that we are understanding the world as in a white supremacist imaginary, until that is disrupted by having a character represented by a non-white character. This is when race becomes salient, that it's not becoming racial because Ariel is Black. It was always racial. And that's the point, is that when you change the character, it becomes obvious that what has been happening is a racial formation in our minds, in the imaginary. So in this talk, I wanted to look at how that works in terms of our approach to the ancient text, but also how, if we can get beyond that and look at or use race as a tool or a lens, we can actually get at, to a certain extent, what the ancients were doing with their imaginary, right? And sort of see that, or at least recognize that when we superimpose our own imaginary, we're actually distorting the ancient perspective. So I'll begin. Now get on to the real topic. The Argonauts. So the Argonautica by Apollonius Rhodius, 3rd century BCE, is the only surviving Greek epic version of the myth of the voyage of the Argo. That is the first Greek ship, the divine Argo, and the adventures of the crew, the Argonauts, as they sailed around the world on the quest for the Golden Fleece. Now, the voyage of the Argo theme predates the Homeric epics. In the Odyssey, for example, Circe mentions Argo Passimelusa, the Argo, everyone's concern. The fragmentary remains of lost Argonauticas, as well as treatments in a range of epic genres, seem to confirm the statement by Circe. And this makes sense. The Argonauts' adventures feature in many of the foundation myths of ancient Greek settlements around the then known world. And in many ways, the behavior of the heroes of the Argo myth, not necessarily the Argonautica, resonates with modern colonial narratives that provide justifications and rationalizations for some of the more brutal aspects of the colonializing process. So perhaps it's because Apollonius's Argonauts are not conquerors that recent interest in how the Argonautica relates to contemporary Ptolemaic imperial ideology, for example, Stephens and Claros, haven't really taken up race as a lens through which to interpret the way the poem treats Greek and non-Greek identities. So this presentation will try to show how race can be a productive hermeneutic tool for understanding the role of epic in creating the ancient Greek racial imaginary. While the Argonauts do not overthrow cities of foreign heroes, they do behave with extreme brutality and indifference toward foreigners they encounter, that is, whenever those foreigners happen to be herders. Only against herders do the Argonauts commit acts of violence that rob their victims of human dignity. So in this presentation, I'll argue that the Argonauts' dehumanizing violence toward herders reflects a racial hierarchy in ancient Greek mythical imagination. And I'm also interested in the extent to which the narrative itself justifies and naturalizes their behavior. And I'll be drawing on the work primarily of Barbara and Karen Fields, Racecraft, and I argue that the discourse of monstrosity in the Argonautica that naturalizes and justifies the hero's violence is what they have theorized as racecraft. Okay. Okay, so the outline of my talk. So first, I will briefly explain the definition of race that I'll be using, drawing primarily on theories and philosophies, theorists and philosophers who treat race not as a noun. This is a call out to my co-editor there, Elena Giusti, but as a verb. To paraphrase Elena's summation of the approach in her forthcoming article, Racializing Dido. So race in this understanding is inextricable from the processes that perpetuate oppressive, dehumanizing, hierarchical relationships among human groups. Barbara and Karen Field's theorizing of racecraft that is the ways in which racial hierarchies become naturalized in the collective consciousness will be central to my approach here. The case study then will be drawn from 3 episodes, or the 3 episodes of the Argonautica, where I argue that racialization is operating, specifically the massacre of the inhabitants at Cyzicus in book 1, the conflict with the Bebrycians in book 2, and the murder of the Libyan herder Caphaerus in book 4. Surprisingly, aside from the Colchians, they're the Argonauts' primary antagonists in the epic, Apollonius' Argonauts rarely get into battles with foreign people. However, in these 3 episodes, the Argonauts fight herders, and these are violent encounters that take place in sites where a Greek settlement will eventually be established. So I argue that the epic depicts the Argonauts behaving in a racist way toward the herders, something akin to what Achille Mbembe refers to in his Necropolitics. The heroes consistently treat the herders they encounter as if they are a group of people worthy of less human dignity than themselves or other heroes. The discourse of monstrosity in the epic naturalizes the heroes' hatred of herders, justifying their dehumanizing behavior toward them. And this discourse, which is based on Hercules' labors, continues, I argue, a Homeric trope, evident, as I've argued in print, in the Odyssey, that imagines heroes and herders to be in a racial dynamic. The racialization of the herders in the epic reverberates into the real world of the readers, transferring their metaphysical monstrosity onto the real historical peoples whom they represent. That is, the enslaved herders in the Greek communities and the indigenous populations of the regions where the conflicts between the Argonauts and the herders take place. And the episode then forms a justification for the founding of the Greek settlement and naturalizing the dehumanization, enslavement, forced migration, extermination, all the other concomitants that go with founding a city or a community. All right, so now we'll move on to race and racism and racecraft. All right, so I'm just going to leave that up there for a second. So beginning with race. Now, it is a commonplace assumption that ancient Greeks were white. This we see sort of quasi-reflected in the various movies recently, the Troy Fall of a City, where they used a Black actor to depict Achilles, and everybody again lost their minds. So, however, this assumption is premised on a misguided essentialist understanding of our own modern racial categories. First, the racial concept of whiteness that is usually applied to the ancient Greeks in such context was born at a specific moment at the dawn of modernity, largely out of Anglo-American imperialist and settler colonialist ideology. Now, in the absence of a common religion, whiteness became the social mechanism to unify the disparate ethnic groups of what Duncan Bell in Dream Worlds of Race refers to as Anglotopia. Whiteness is a crucial element of our modern racial concept that cannot be denied. However, its emergence required the particular historical circumstances of the Enlightenment, when sentimental and philosophical commitments to human equality and the condemnation of slavery clashed with proto-capitalist economic and social imperatives for an imperialism that relied heavily on slavery as time went on, more and more. And this is Horn and others. So it cannot be underscored enough that the shape racial categories take are not ontologically independent of the historical, their historical contingent social, religious, economic, and other demands for the dominating hierarchy, where some people are rendered in the collective understanding to be sufficiently unworthy of full human dignity, so that they could be, therefore could be subjected to the violence inherent in slavery, apartheid, genocide, etc., without consequence. Now, in this period, the modern period, race science emerged as a field within the natural sciences, especially to settle debates about who could and who could not be enslaved. Theorists of race emphasize its function as a tool or technology for exercising and naturalizing power by symbolizing social conflict in physiognomic and phenotypical differences. But the observation of Merck-Jung in racial world-making is crucial, notably that, quote, race critique that has overemphasized the visual epistemology of race and its basis in scientific racism and comparative anatomy. He advocates emphasizing on the contrary, the salience of race, that is the context when we notice race operating, what we are taught to notice as race. So, however, the particular somatic or cultural criteria that define a group or that make up the criteria of a group as superior or inferior are themselves products of historical contingency. And in the pre-modern context, the epistemologies of race, the ability to know race, are rooted in different signs than they are in our modern world. So what remains stable, however, which is what I want to focus on in the definition of race, comes with that which remains stable and across time and space is the presumed non-human or subhuman metaphysical qualities that allow members of a group so defined to have their human dignity alienated from them. It is not a coincidence then that the very physiognomic features that prevailed among those trafficking and enslaving Africans in the Americas became the indicators of full inalienable humanity. And by contrast, the very physiognomic features that distinguished the vast majority of the people who were at that time being trafficked and enslaved became the indices of an inferior human being who was made by nature to be enslaved. These criteria, from which we get our white and Black races, became the findings of race science just in time to give license to the many slave-holding intellectuals a justification to continue exploiting forced labor of enslaved Africans. And I don't think it's a coincidence either that at the same time, the ancient Greeks and Romans became members of the white race. In notes on the state of Virginia, we can witness, yeah, maybe it's right there. We can witness Thomas Jefferson, of all people, making the ancient Greeks and Romans white. These are one of the earliest sort of statements of this. And arguing that the natural and scientifically established racial differences between Blacks and whites were a huge obstacle in his day to the abolition of slavery. And however, he cites Homer, and he says, half of his excellence, broad-seeing Zeus removes from a man whomsoever the day of slavery whensoever the day of slavery overpowers him. Now, this verse hardly supports an argument for natural slavery. The prima facie meaning of these verses is that no one is born to be enslaved, but the process of being enslaved robs a person of their human dignity. But Jefferson goes on to explain that the slaves of which Homer speaks were white. So he reasons on further reference to the precedent of classical antiquity. So this unfortunate difference of color and perhaps of faculty is a powerful obstacle to the emancipation of these people. Among the Romans, emancipation required but one effort. The slave, then made free, might mix without staining the blood of his master. But with us, a second is necessary, unknown to history. When freed, he is to be removed beyond the reach of mixture. So according to Jefferson, the Greeks and the Romans who were white made the mistake of enslaving members of their own race. The quote unquote white and Black races were always existed in nature. And those unenlightened ancients should only have enslaved people of inferior humanity, that is, people with Black skin. What the Greeks and the Romans thought about Black and white skin is completely uninteresting to Jefferson. So the ancient Greeks may have considered themselves to be superior to non-Greeks. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that. And some Greeks superior to other Greeks. But what they certainly did not do was see themselves as part of a superior white race. Whiteness connoted, for the most part, femininity and foreignness and weakness. You see McCoskey and Kaufman. The historical reality is that white skin did not signify racial superiority, and Black skin did not signify racial inferiority. Skin color signified nothing about who was the natural master or who was the natural slave. And most of the writing on race and antiquity will cover that, from Snowden to Kennedy forthcoming. In other words, skin color was not central to how the ancient Greeks and Romans constructed race. Nevertheless, belief in the whiteness of the ancient Greeks persists, even in the face of indisputable scientific evidence to the contrary, vis-a-vis race being something genetic, precisely because whiteness itself is a modern racial concept that relies heavily on the symbolic power of the ancient Greeks and Romans as embodying the purest form of white/Western civilization. Now, accordingly, talking about race in reference to the ancient Greeks and Romans is dangerous. We lost control of the lights here. Okay. Sorry. Accordingly, talking about race in reference to the ancient Greeks and Romans is inherently dangerous today. For either we are reinstantiating this hall of distorted mirrors, that is our modern white supremacist ideology, by retrojecting, like Jefferson and like the guy that wanted to change the skin color of the mermaid back onto the ancients, our own racial salience onto the skin color of the historical figures or mythological characters, or we are applying a critical approach that is going to undermine an important pillar of whiteness and has the potential to trigger a violent response. So at risk of doing that, we're going to do that. So the critical approach, though, requires us shifting the focus away from race as a collection of descriptors to the power dynamic that produce clearly defined social groups, and to attribute themselves. Sorry, let me go back, say that again. So the critical race approach that we're going to apply here requires that we shift the focus away from race as a collection of descriptors to the power dynamics that produce clearly defined social groups, power dynamics that attribute to one group, which one group attributes to itself all humanity, while withholding it from another group or groups through various means. And also the claim, the dominant group, or the group identifying as the dominant group, claim the right to prevent their humanity from being alienated, while at the same time denying that right to another group or other groups. I hope that's clear, right? Okay. So in other words, race is, we're likely to find race operating in situations in texts where there is an unequal recognition of human dignity in a power dynamic. And so this is what we're going to be applying here. Under this conceptualization, race happens in overt processes of dehumanization, such as slavery, genocide, genocidal violence, etc. But also as well as in mundane denials of human dignity, which I've argued in the case of the Odyssey. An accompanying collective belief that the oppressed in the dynamic have metaphysical traits, invisible traits, in common with members of a group from whom humanity is denied is crucial. And this is where the idea of monstrosity kicks in. The point is then that the racialized group is exposed to the risk of dehumanization by another group, especially those who enjoy full humanity. Now, racialized groups can, of course, racialize each other, so that I'm not going to deny that. So when looking for the salience of race and racism in the ancient world, or in this case, the ancient imaginary of the ancient world, we're not necessarily trying to find physical features or geographical origins or even cultural attributes. Instead, I suggest that we look for situations where a dehumanizing, oppressive power dynamic exists among the groups. So now this brings us to the issue of racecraft. Let me see if I have it. Okay, we'll hold on to that. All right. Briefly on racecraft. So we have our dehumanizing power dynamic. Barbara and Karen Fields have conceptualized racecraft as the various processes by which this racial hierarchy is instilled, justified, and naturalized and perpetuated in a society's collective understanding. So this is the mystical aspect of it. Racecraft, they figure as a kind of witchcraft that harnesses social, civic, and political and legal, religious, all the aspects of society to convince and perpetuate the belief that there is a racial hierarchy and that it exists in nature and there's nothing that can change it. So racecraft then generates and sustains these racial ideologies through rational or violent, emotional, experiential, and even imaginative modes of acquiring knowledge. And that's what I want to focus on with EPIC as an imaginative mode of acquiring knowledge. And this then brings me to Miranda Fricker's important discussion of epistemic injustice. Miranda Ficker's view of hermeneutical injustice ties in very closely with the field's theorization of racecraft. For Fricker, there are two kinds of epistemic injustice. That is a wrong done to someone specifically in their capacity as a knower. She calls the two types testimonial injustice and hermeneutical injustice. The testimonial injustice occurs when the knower is not granted due credibility. Hermeneutical injustice, which is more interesting here, happens when the knower cannot make their social experiences known because of a gap in the collective interpretive resources. And the gap arises because the knower's experience lies on the margins or outside of the hegemonic understanding of the social world. Systematically oppressed groups are also hermeneutically marginalized. According to Fricker, and more importantly, they're not permitted to participate in the creation of the collective knowledge vis-a-vis social experiences that directly affect them. And they're prevented from contributing their perspective on situations and events, especially when the powerful have no interest in achieving a proper interpretation, perhaps indeed where they have a positive interest in sustaining the extant misinterpretation. So a crucial aspect of racecraft then involves controlling the interpretive frames around the oppressive power relationships to render the inherent violence morally unproblematic. So racecraft is a suitable theoretical frame then for understanding the relationship between heroic epic and ancient constructions of race, since epic is targeting the elite audience. In most ancient Greek communities, heroic epic was held in high esteem and was an authoritative source of collective knowledge, beliefs, and ideologies. Moreover, epic centers the perspective of the dominant group in the mythic world, the group with whom the ruling elites identified, some even claim descent from. So accordingly then, epic is the perfect vehicle for creating and reinforcing collective beliefs in the naturalness of social hierarchies in the real world. Now, the Argonautica. Yay, okay. So the Argonautica readily lends itself, I would argue, to a critical race approach. The epic is an ethnography and geography of the Greek world in verse. The voyage takes the heroes through all three continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa. And along the way, the cultural peculiarities of the different peoples are described. Moreover, the Argonauts are presented as purveyors of Greek culture. They build altars and shrines to the Greek gods, especially Apollo, the god most closely associated with founding new Greek settlements. However, the Argonauts are not conquerors, as I said, a distinction setting them apart from the heroes of the Homeric epics. They never sack cities of other heroes whom they get into violent conflicts with, much less abduct and enslave their women and girls. Whereas these are aspects that are central to the Iliad and the Odyssey. With Jason in charge, the heroes are bearers of Greek culture. They dress well, they approach foreigners, first usually on equal terms with diplomacy. Then things go bad, then they get into fights. And they even do this when encountering a community ruled by women. So the Argonauts, however, treat herders when they encounter them differently. They always have violent clashes with them. And in all three cases, so there's only 3 cases where the Argonauts get into violent clashes, and the heroes treat them with less dignity than other heroes. And this, I argue, reveals the racial dimension. So the first episode is on Cyzicus. So Cyzicus, as you can see, where's Cyzicus? Where's that? So Cyzicus is here. That's our first episode. Notice where this, the geography is important. So the Argonauts approach the Symplegades. They come to the area that is Cyzicus, and there are 2 distinct groups of people inhabit the region. One dwells in caves on the island, and the other lives in the city on an isthmus and the plain. Now, in his initial topographical and ethnographical introduction to the episode, the narrator forecasts that the Argonauts will massacre both groups, and that later, at the exact location, the descendants of Neleus will found the Greek settlement that existed in the poet's day. So we have two groups living on the island, and one here he describes them. The one group, those who live in the surrounding territory, they live on the island of the Mountain of the Bears, and it is inhabited by the violently aggressive Hubristai and wild Agrioi, earthborn Gegenes, who were a great wonder, Thalma, to behold for their neighbors. So he's already monstrified this group. They each, then they had 6 arms and legs, etc., 6 arms and whatnot. And then the other group, he says, let's get the next one. Yeah, and the other group, he explicitly identifies as men. So so the isthmus and the plain on the other side are inhabited by men, Doliones. Ruling over them was the hero, Cyzicus, son of Aeneas, who gets a genealogy. And so the point is that Apollonius is establishing we're dealing with people over here, which are the heroes, and we're dealing with monsters over here. So the topography, moreover, connects the episode to the Phaeacians episode, the Laestrygonians episode, and the Cyclops episode in the Odyssey, and suggesting that the Argonauts will encounter two different kinds of welcomes from the two groups, and indeed they do. Now, with the discourse of monstrosity, the toponyms that are connecting the text to the Odyssey help to align the Earthborn with the Cyclopes in the Odyssey, who in that epic are the literal manifestation of the monstrous metaphysics of the racialized herders that are enslaved on Odyssey. And you can see my article on that. Well, just like Homer's arrogant and lawless Cyclopes, who live in caves on the mountain peaks with their flocks, it's Odyssey 9, 110 to 120. Apollonius's violent, aggressive Hubristai monsters live in a wild state, Agrioi, on peaks of mountain of bears. And they were also a wonder to behold, Thalma, for people living in the region, just like Polyphemus was a monstrous wonder to behold in Odyssey 9, 190. So the contrast between the two groups living in the exact location further reinforces the epic racecraft. So unlike the Earthborn, who are not referred to as men, the humanity of the Doliones is stressed by the emphatic position, as I said, of Aneres. And then what's going to happen is trouble starts in how the Argonauts kill both groups. Trouble starts the next morning when the Argonauts follow Cyzicus's advice to move the Argo from Fair Harbor to Blockade Harbor. And some heroes then climb up the mountain and they look for the routes. And while they're doing that, the Earthborn attack the Argonauts. I think that, yeah. So according to the narrator, the sight of the Argo in the harbor provokes the Earthborn to rush down the mountain, hurling boulders. The scene, of course, recalls other monstrous beings from the Odyssey, the Laestrygonians hurling boulders down on Odysseus's ship. Now, what's interesting then is how the narrator then frames this. According to the narrator, these Earthborn are probably attacking, he's guessing, of course, the narrator, probably attacking them because they've been reared by Hera as a labor for Hercules. Now, so when the rest of the heroes join the fight, the ensuing massacre of the Earthborn prompts an extended simile that characterizes the Argonauts' treatment of the Earthborn as a dehumanizing atrocity. As when woodcutters throw down long timbers recently felled by their axes, in a line along the edge of the sea. So by absorbing moisture, they can receive the strong pegs. Thus, at the narrows of the white-capped harbor, they laid out one after another. Some in heaps, dipping their heads and chests into the salt water, while they stretched their lower limbs out on land. Others, conversely, rested their heads on the sandy shore and their feet in the deep water. Both groups became prey for birds and fish alike. Now, the simile, the image of the simile of corpses becoming food for birds and fish can't but evoke the vivid picture at the beginning of the Iliad of a battlefield littered with unburied corpses being defiled by dogs and birds. And with it, the theme of dehumanization. The image in the Iliad concretizes Achilles' destructive wrath in that initial programmatic scene and points forward to his depraved treatment of Hector's corpse. Later, the two heroes meet on the battlefield. And here, Hector, let me see, this could be, no. Okay, I don't have this quote here. Here, Achilles and Hector's exchange is important. Hector suggests that, well, the victor of their fight should allow the body of the defeated to be properly buried. Achilles responds by racializing their relationship. He says, just as faithful oaths can't exist between lions and men, and wolves and lambs don't have sympathy for one another in their hearts, but perpetually think evil against one another, so you and I have no friendly feelings, and there will not be any oath between us, at least not before one of us falls and slakes thirsty Ares, the stout enemy. So Homer's gods, though, allow the Greeks a great deal of latitude in the Trojan War, but they draw the line at the dehumanization of a hero's body by another hero. Achilles sneers at Hector's suggestion that there is an honorable way for heroes to kill one another, declaring that he does not regard Hector as the same kind of being as himself. And then after slaying Hector, he makes good on his promise to desecrate his body, robbing Hector of his human dignity. Achilles drags his corpse behind his chariot around the city walls for days, and thereby denying him his humanity, until, of course, the gods intervene. There's a potential critique then built into the Argonauts' treatment of the earthborn that the allusion suggests, but it's countered by the way the Argonauts treat the corpses of Cyzicus and the Doliones. So the Argonauts then kill Cyzicus. This is the here, and due to a sort of mishap of luck, the Argonauts are sent back in a storm. Cyzicus doesn't realize it's the Argonauts. They have a clash, and the Argonauts wipe out Cyzicus and his people. And what's interesting is that the Argonauts then don't just leave their bodies out to rot as they normally do when it's herders. They actually participate in the funeral for Cyzicus, and even have funeral games for him and honoring him as a hero. So there's clearly a double standard operating in the way the Argonauts are treating the two groups of people, and a double standard in the way in which the narrator treats the two groups of people that are going to be eliminated so that the Greek community can then come in later. All right, so now let's move on to the next episode, which is at Amycus. Now here, the Argonauts encounter Amycus, the herder king. And the Argonauts, so the boxing match with Amycus is a staple in the Argonautic myth. See Kuiper's 1997. And in most versions after Polydeuces defeats their king, the Babricians do have a battle with the heroes in which they end up being massacred. Now, depicting Amycus as a herder, modeled on the Cyclops, is pretty typical. It would appear from the versions that, or evidence of versions that may not exist. And it particularly was favored by the Sicilian poets who depicted the Amycus episode, Epicharmus, etc. They, other than Theocritus, which I can come to in our discussion, the depiction of Amycus as a herder seems quite traditional. So Apollonius doesn't seem to be deviating too much from the path in representing him as a herder. And now what's interesting is that he too is described in ways that make him like the Cyclops, but also in the boxing match, there's an explicit counter comparison or contrasting comparison between him and Polydeuces. So again, he's identified with the Cyclops, and now when they're fighting, he is monstrified. One of them, that is Amycus, seemed like the monstrous offspring of deadly Typhoeus, even of Earth herself, and like those she brought forth long ago in anger at Zeus. So he's not only a monster, but he's a monster that is in opposition to Zeus, the chief god. However, his opponent, Polydeuces, who is a son of Zeus, is compared to a heavenly star whose twinkling is most beautiful when it shines through the darkness, such was Zeus's son, still sprouting the down of a beard and still bright-eyed, etc. So we have already a contrast here, and when the Argonauts, when Polydeuces, the simile makes Amycus and Polydeuces members of different hostile races, I would argue. Metaphorically, Amycus has the monstrous essence of earthborn Typhoeus or his son, and Polydeuces the divine essence of his actual father, Zeus. The boxing match thus reenacts on the human plane the Gigantomachy, the cosmic battle between the gods and giants, justifying the murder of Amycus in terms of the established divine order. The analogy forces the readers to side with Zeus and hate Amycus. So in the battle after Amycus's death, it's also interesting. The narrator treats Amycus's men somewhat like heroes. However, the imagery keeps the racial hostility centered. Except for the first Babrician to fall, murdered by Castor, the rest of them are actually memorialized with the Argonauts who slay them. And then there's yet another simile. As when on a wintry day, gray wolves, as the Argonauts, by eluding keen-scented dogs and their shepherds, attack and terrify countless sheep in their pens, they search for the one which dash upon them, each person carry them off, survey many at once, while the sheep just throng together from all sides, falling over one another. So the Argonauts grievously terrified the arrogant Hyperphialos Babricians. And what's interesting here is that the Babricians are shepherds, right? It's so that there's a kind of mixture here with the simile. Anyways, or as a great swarm of bees is smoked out within a rock by shepherds, or rather by beekeepers. And of course, for a while they buzz and rush around wildly all together in their hive. However, the sooty smoke suffocates them. They dart forth from their rock, so the Babricians no longer remain steadfast, but instead they scatter into Babricia to report the doom of Amycus. So here, the simile depicts the racial hostility between the Argonauts and herders as natural hostility between prey and predator. The wolves attacking sheep, of course, recalls Achilles' reply to Hector's request that they agree to behave honorably. And in the second simile, as if getting carried away in a stream of consciousness, the narrator begins by equating the heroes with shepherds, but then correcting himself. That's how I read it. And he changes the image from beekeepers, from shepherds to beekeepers. An analogy between heroes and shepherds, of course, would not really work. It would even seem gauche disruption of the imagery of the previous simile, likening the Argonauts to wolves that eluded the shepherds. But it also would have blurred the consistent racial distinction that's being established in the epic and had been established already, I would argue, in Homer, between heroes and shepherds. So the second simile shifts the analogy to honey production, of comparison between, comparing the massacre of the Babrikians to something that is an essential aspect of the sweetness of Greek civilization. Much like the way the massacre of the Earthborn is compared to shipbuilding, again, something that is central to Greek civilization. So heroes murdering shepherds and raiding their flocks are rendered as natural and a civilizing act in these comparisons. And both similes suggest that the Argonauts had a predatory intention in the beginning when they landed anyway. And then the last episode, which is that last episode is in Africa. And in this episode, what's interesting is that the narrator's attitude toward the Argonauts behaving, or their monster slaying, has changed. So in the previous conflicts, these took place on different ancient continents, Europe and Asia, respectively. This final conflict between the Argonauts and the herders takes place on the third continent, Africa, near the historical site of the future Ptolemaic settlement named after Berenike II, the queen, who ruled Egypt and Cyrene at the time that Apollonius finished the epic, according to my dating. After the Argonauts had carried the Argo for 12 days and 12 nights over the Libyan desert, they finally set the ship down at Lake Triton. Being very thirsty, they run around like dogs, we're told, looking for a spring, and they reach the tree with the golden apples of the Hesperides. And there they find the Hesperides nymphs mourning over the dead serpent that used to guard the apples. And eventually they disappear when they see the Argonauts, and eventually Orpheus gets the nymphs to reappear, and he asks them how to find some water, or find a spring for water. And the nymphs then point out the spring that Hercules discovered when he killed the serpent. And as they run off to drink it, and then when they realize that Hercules was nearby, the Argonauts decide that they're going to search for him. Several of them do. And among those who run off to search for him is Canthus, and whose death we already told in the beginning that he will not make it out of Libya. And here we have the narrator says, "But you, Canthus, the destructive fate seized you in Libya. By chance you found some flocks grazing, but a herdsman was looking after them. And as you intended to lead them off to your needy companions in order to protect his sheep, he slew you with a stone. He was, after all, no lowlife. But Caphaerus, the grandson of Lycurian Phoebus, the noble maiden, Acacalis, although she was his very own daughter, Minos exiled her to Libya at some point because she was carrying the heavy offspring of the god. Nevertheless, she gave birth to Phoebus's glorious son, whom they called Amphithemis and Garamas. Amphithemis later slept with the Tritonian nymph, and she bore him Nasmon and mighty Caphaerus, who at the time slew Canthus in defense of his sheep. However, he didn't escape the trouble at the hands of the heroes as soon as they learned what he had done. And they found the corpse, that is, of Canthus, and the minions took it up and brought it back. And they buried him in the earth and mourning him, not Capharis. The sheep they let off for themselves. So in this final instance, the Argonauts behave as they always do. They murder the herder and leave his body out to rot. They run off with his sheep, etc. However, the narrator frames this within a context where the nymphs have already negatively represented the slaying of the serpent by Hercules, and the narrator is very sparse with details about the behavior of the Argonauts or a judgment about the Argonauts. In fact, he heroizes the shepherd. So to conclude, then, what I've been trying to do is apply a critical race studies approach to these episodes in the Argonautica, where Greek heroes get into violent conflicts with herders. The close readings show that the Argonauts operate in a mythical world where a racial hierarchy allows them to treat herders as if they were monsters. The framing of the Argonauts' violence against herders as monster slaying, I would argue, or I've been arguing, is racecraft. By figuring herders as monsters that is not human enough to deserve the dignity of a proper burial, the moral questions are taken out of consideration. A fuller treatment is needed to explore how the narrator's persona further complicates this. In particular, in this last episode, there's much more to say about what goes on there. And also in looking at why the narrator is okay with the violence of the Argonauts in the Europe and Asia context, but not in the African context. And so let's see here. Yeah, so I would suggest that more work needs to be done by me on this, and I will take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jackie. I'm going without a microphone now, but if you stay near the microphone, I think what people online, I think, will mostly want to hear are your responses to questions. I thought that was an absolutely fascinating exploration, and I'm struck in particular by how you refuse to allow us any easy answers with these three very interesting case studies.
Yeah.
So our Leventis fellow, Ben Weinberg, has kindly agreed to run around the hall with a microphone for anyone who wants to ask a question in person. And Francis will be keeping an eye on our online participants to see if anyone wants to ask a question there. We'll wait and see what hands go up. I hope the call for questions is sufficiently clear for people online, because I know I'm not like.
There's something in the chat here.
Excellent. Right. Well, shall we start with that then?
Yeah, sure. So the question is, hi, Professor Murray, so this is from Jeremy now. Oh,
yeah. Sorry, I was
sorry, thank you so much for an incredibly rich and thought-provoking lecture. Do you think there's an aspect of civilization in scarecrows in these lectures? In particular, struck by the comparison of the earthly giant corpses of timbers in the shipbuilding. Those back to obviously lying with the cyclops as compared to
exactly, yeah.
And you see the subjugation of natural causes, the humans have already seen navigation. Often in colonial discourses, the colonizers justify their needs of aggression and violence by perceiving them as bringing civilizations to the Greek stereotypes.
Yes, I definitely think that's the case. That's why I think that simile, and I brought together it with the beekeeping, the honey making, precisely for that, to show that there's this civilizing discourse going on. Yeah. So yeah, that's a great observation, Jeremy. Hi. But yeah, that is important, I think, in I think that perhaps these modern civilizing narratives are also drawing on these texts, right? So it's not independent, I would say. We're bringing civilization to the world is not necessarily independent of the epic, the Homeric epic. Yeah. Or, yeah.
I was very interested, just following on from that, about that shepherd simile that you drew out, and the idea of using a shepherd simile to talk about violence against shepherds. And I was struck by it in relation to Miranda Fricker's comments about hermeneutic injustice.
Yes.
And the way in which certain modes of knowledge, the herder's mode of knowledge, I was thinking at the beginning that the herder's mode of knowing the world and being in the world is being pushed to the margins.
Exactly.
In favor of, you know, shipbuilding, etc. But it's also in a way being co-opted, isn't it? It's being appropriated.
Right. Yeah. I think that, so in the book 2 episode, I think the narrator likes the shepherd similes because they're in the Iliad. Right. And so this is the first battle that the Argonauts are going to get into that isn't tainted with, oh, you killed your host, which is the previous battle was with the Cyzicus. They managed to, you know, commit a huge sacrilege by killing their host. So this is a battle where, opportunity to give the Argonauts some typical Homeric, heroic chaos. And so narrator gets run off by wolf similes. These are in the Iliad, but then it doesn't work because when he tries to continue on with it, he runs out of that. It's not going to work because he just made them the opposite of shepherds, and so he can't make them shepherds now. And so and so I definitely think that it's partly because it exists in the epic world, and the narrator, book 2, and I'm sure Martina Kuipers will back me up on this. Book 2 is the most male-oriented, heroic book, right? Where they actually get into, or almost get into, things that look like, okay, they could be like the Homeric heroes. And so I think that that's what the narrator is trying to go for, but then runs away with, his stream of consciousness runs away with him, and yeah.
Any questions from those present?
I see a hand back there.
There's going to be a microphone coming up to you.
There's also another question.
Let's see, how's that?
We can hear you. Is it loud enough? Yeah.
Well, thanks very much. The preface to the question is that I know nothing about this, and I find that fascinating. But as I understand the more general theoretical argument, you're sort of saying that racialization of racecraft.
Right. Well, racialization
is a kind of comes into play systematically through dehumanizing, civilizationing, and all monstrosity, ism, etc. Whenever two sort of social groups are in conflict and start to sort of dehumanize each other. So racialization can be a powerful, systematic, ideological project in circumstances that aren't anything specifically to do with what we would now have.
Right, yeah.
Well, I think that's really good, although I think speciesism is possibly more relevant than racialization, since of course every dominant group has conducted itself by such discourse and civilization and so on. But any response to that would be very interesting.
Well, okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Herders, I find that fascinating. Surely they're the underlying sort of causal structure we need to be proven there. Our class structure.
Yes, yeah.
These are socioeconomic processes of ideology, humanization, or the mode of production.
Okay, so that's great. Yeah, so indeed, the intersection of class and race are, I think, important to bear in mind. And what the difference, what makes it race for me is that you can have class without dehumanization. You can have, there could be, I mean, theoretically, it's possible, but in the sense that what's happening here is that the herders are enslaved. Like they're an enslaved group. They're usually enslaved in antiquity. that's what you get them for, because your wealth is your cattle. You get herders and they're enslaved. So in the enslavement already, you've dehumanized them in my view, in that respect. And then they are a group that are recognizable by what they're wearing or what they're doing. And they are subject to what I consider they don't have the same human dignity is not granted to them. They cannot kill, as we see with Capharis, he cannot just kill the Argonaut and protect his sheep, protect his property, the way the Argonauts could, right? Because the idea is that we, the reader, would be offended if he were allowed to kill the Argonauts without any consequence, right? It's because we identify with him. So in that respect, there, speciesism and there's also hatred. That's the other thing you need to have, I think, in this. And the hatred is something that the narrator is generating through this monstrification, right? So I think you can have speciesism, but even there, that I think you're broaching racism there. But I definitely think that you need hatred is to be manufactured through these stories. So in this imaginary world, the narrator is manufacturing hatred by consistently sort of metaphorizing them as monsters, right? And so you side with the more human, the more beautiful person there. So that makes sense. Yeah.
We've got quite a few questions online.
Yeah, there's the next one here. Oh, we can just do this. There's one here by Ahuvia Kahane. You want to read it?
Yeah.
I don't have my glasses on, so it's like.
Also great to see a reference to Mbembe.
Oh, Mbembe, yeah.
Important work, otherwise not frequently mentioned in our discipline. Race is quite rightly the cited seminal debates today, but giving you a slight move away from historically contingent post-enlightenment characteristics of race, so whiteness, etc., and your emphasis on defining racism with dehumanizing methods. Should we not speak more generally of the wrong distribution of the sensible regime of knowledge and conversely of the need for politics in a Mansurian sense? Exactly.
A similar question to the one that was just asked. Yeah. So yeah, I would just say it's a similar answer. I do think that that is kind of what I'm arguing, right? That I'm saying we should, because I'm trying to emphasize what is the salience aspect instead of looking for the noun, but race as a noun, but looking at the salience of where does race show up in the text that we can say, okay, this behavior of the characters seems to be based in a hatred that we are supposed to align with or not, or at least recognize it as something that's going on. And that's high hierarchy. There's a in epic, there's a discourse of monstrosity that's sort of justifying why the heroes are behaving like that. And then that's so I'm just using it as a lens to see how that works there.
I think that's fascinating. And I suppose that the reference to Rancière, it makes me think of the comments you were making at the beginning of your talk about, you know, when is race made visible?
Right.
So this argument about people saying, oh, you're bringing race into it.
Right.
And the proper response is no,
race is always into
there.
it. Yeah, race was always there.
And it struck me, particularly around your discussion of the Jefferson example, the way in which so many of us have been schooled to think of whiteness not as a race,
right,
but as a neutral
right,
state of existence.
exactly.
That race only comes in when you're talking about non-white people.
Right. And that's the racecraft.
And that's the racecraft.
Right, because
yes,
we don't recognize it, because the point of racecraft is to make you not think that race is operating because it's so natural, right? And so, yeah.
What me there is really interesting was therefore the way in which that traditional line that so many of us have learned when we learn about classical antiquity, well, for the Greeks and Romans, they didn't organize things around racial difference.
Right.
Therefore,
or at least not the way we understand racial difference.
Yeah. And so the thought process goes, therefore race doesn't exist, therefore they must be all white. Because if race doesn't exist, everyone's white.
Right, yeah, or yeah, and Black people weren't in their world, as Jefferson would have you believe, that they didn't know any Black people in their world. And so that's why they didn't think to enslave the actually naturally enslaved people, because they never met them. This is the kind of argument that comes up. But no, yeah, but this is the view that when we look in the ancient world and we encounter people with Black skin, race is all of a sudden a topic, right? And it was not a topic in the text, but it's a topic we're imposing on the text. And that's why it's so difficult then to translate whenever someone has Black skin. There's like a freak out that goes on similar to what happens with the mermaid thing, because we are now encountered with our construction of race, which is Black and white. The fact that the text itself is part of how we construct, in terms of how we've been taught the text, to construct our world as Black and white. And yet in the text, they're not really doing what we need them to do in terms of Black and white, right? So, there are very few Black slaves we encounter in the text. But we make slaves Black in the text, though. Like if it's a slave, if we're going to represent them, he's going to be Black. And it's like, that might not have been the case. Highly likely that it might not, it probably was not. So this is the problem, I think.
Sorry, we should.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Back on the questions.
There's two more. I don't know if you want to share.
Oh, yeah. Would anyone from the floor like to ask a question? As this kind of representation of people in the physical world, and then
you guys have priority. You're the real ones.
We'll go to the next one from Ellen and Lucy.
Oh, Ellen, okay.
Thank you, Jackie. This is so working. There's some quick parallels in the Aeneid with one of the guests. Everything gets the Latins, you have both wood cutting and the new file. Richard Thomas written about this in terms of reminiscent of Saturday.
Yeah.
And the Latins smoked out of the palace of Latin.
Yes.
Which Virgil is explicitly looking back at Apollonius.
Yes.
The Carthaginians of book one are also used, which is interesting in terms of future elements of Greek.
Yeah.
Reverses perhaps civilized.
Yeah, and so well, we've talked about, I've talked about this, and in fact, I have another article on this particular simile in Virgil, arguing about Aeneas being the shepherd there. Like, so it's a problem now. You have a hero who is made into a shepherd, and it's explicitly alluding to the Apollonius text. And I've argued that what's going on, when you think about it from a Roman perspective, the good sort of comparanda to think about is when Cicero talks about the way in which Verres allows shepherds to run wild on Sicily or have weapons on Sicily, right? And how that's just that it conjures up all of the slave revolt ideas. So, and that's what's going on. I argue that that's what's going on with Aeneas and Turnus being connected to shepherds in their fight, is that we're building into the Aeneid also the slave revolts that were happening as part of the foundation of Rome. And so there's a racialization going on of Aeneas. There is some suggestion that he may not be a legitimate person. haven't delved into that, the questionable about his birth and whatever, but I do think there's something going on where we're comparing him to he and Turnus together, comparing them to leaders of slave revolts, and that would be certainly a racializing narrative. And yes, the Carthaginians being beasts, that I think that points forward to that idea that, yeah, they're again connecting them through Apollonius to this idea that they're going to be enslaved ultimately in Roman consciousness, eventually through colonization. So, yeah.
There's one more question. I know we're running quite over now. So I know that's quite easy to see. So if you do, please don't involve.
Okay, let's take one more question.
Just one more question. Yeah.
Applaud Jackie and have a drink.
Then we can have a drink. Yeah.
This comes from Fabio Lascomfellow. Thank you very much for that, Marie. Fantastic discussion. Do you think that the Hellenistic epic is used as a kind of modern Aeneid in terms of how race is used?
Well, we were just mentioning, yeah, I do think that not just Apollonius, though, I do think Virgil, Homer as well, right? Because the shepherd hero dichotomy is in Homer already. And then Apollonius puts it in more of a, I guess, settler colonial discourse in that. And then, yeah, I think then Virgil, because of how heavily influenced Virgil is by both, I think it's a combination. But certainly there where he's picking specifically some of the similes that Apollonius is using, you could absolutely say, yeah, he's using the Apollonius particularly in that moment when he wants to talk about the idea of shepherds being an enslaved population and the problems that the fears that Romans have of being overrun by their slaves, etc. Yeah.
Wow, well, I don't know about anyone else, but I feel like my brain has had a wonderful workout and sort of post-gymnastic glow. I hope that you will join Jackie and the Institute members for a drink downstairs. And before we go, I'd like to say thank you to Ben for helping with the questions. Thank you to Jess, who has been taking pictures. Thank you to Francis, who's been monitoring everything. And above all, can we say a huge thank you, please, to Professor Murray for a wonderful talk.
Thank you all.